The morning Louisa Grady found the dying man in her creek bed, she had already decided that the day could not possibly get any worse. She had been wrong about that, as she had been wrong about a good many things since coming to the New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878. But finding a half-dead stranger face down in the shallow water that cut through the eastern corner of her property was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of discovery that reset a person's entire understanding of what constituted a bad morning. She had gone to the creek to check the small diversion channel she had dug in late April, the one that carried water to her kitchen garden and was forever silting up with red clay. The sun had barely cleared the ridge to the east, painting the scrubland in shades of copper and amber, and the air still held the cool sweetness of night. She carried a short-handled spade over her shoulder and a tin cup of coffee in her free hand, walking the familiar path through the sage and bunch grass with her eyes half closed, turning over in her mind the long list of tasks that never seemed to shorten no matter how hard she worked. She nearly stepped on him. He was lying at the edge of the creek, where the bank curved inward and created a shallow pool no more than 4 inches deep, and the water was running past him, and around him as though he were simply another stone the creek had decided to rest beside. His face was turned to one side, which was the only reason he had not drowned. He wore a trail-worn coat of dark wool, boots that had seen considerable hard use, and a hat that had come off and settled in the reeds 3 feet downstream. His right hand was curled around nothing at all, as though he had been holding something important and lost it somewhere in whatever ordeal had brought him here. Louisa set down her coffee cup and her spade. She knelt beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat, half expecting to feel nothing. What she felt instead was a pulse, faint and uneven but present, like a watch that hasn't been wound properly but is still, stubbornly, keeping time. She rolled him onto his back. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair plastered flat against his forehead and a jaw covered in several days of rough beard. His face was pale beneath the sun weathering, and when she pulled open his coat, she found the source of his trouble immediately. A wound in his left side, just below the ribs, that had been poorly bandaged with what appeared to be a strip torn from a shirt. The bandage was saturated and dark, and the skin around it was hot to the touch and beginning to show the angry red streaking that meant infection had already taken root. "Lord have mercy," Louisa said to no one in particular. She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman and had been one her whole life, shaped by a childhood in Missouri that had offered very little room for sentiment and even less for foolishness. She was 26 years old, widowed 13 months ago when her husband Thomas had been thrown from a horse and broken his neck in the pasture behind the house she now ran alone, and she had learned since then that survival required clear thinking above all else. The clear thinking told her several things in quick succession. He would die if left here. Getting him to the house would be extremely difficult without help, and there was no help within 6 miles in any direction. She could ride for the town of Silo Flats, which was 8 miles northeast, but that would take the better part of 2 hours, and she did not think he had 2 hours to spare, not with that wound looking the way it looked. She made her decision the same way she made all of her decisions, which was to simply begin doing the most necessary thing and trust that the rest would follow. She went back to the house, hitched the mule to the flatbed wagon, and drove it across the scrubland to the creek bank, bouncing over rocks and through brush without particular care for the wagon's comfort. She spread 2 horse blankets on the wagon bed. Then she went back to the man, and with considerable effort that left her breathless and shaking, she managed to drag him up the bank and wrestle him onto the wagon. She was not a large woman, 5 feet and 4 inches with a lean, work-hardened frame, but she had been moving heavy things by herself for over a year, and she had developed a stubborn efficiency about it. She drove him back to the house, got him inside by the same grim method of dragging, and got him onto the narrow cot in the back room that she used for storage. She cut away the ruined bandage, cleaned the wound with the carbolic solution she kept on hand because out here infections killed more people than bullets did, and redressed it as cleanly as she could manage. She had no doctor's training, but she had a good deal of frontier practicality, and she had watched the traveling doctor tend wounds on 3 separate occasions and had paid close attention each time. His fever climbed through the morning and peaked somewhere around midday. She kept cool cloths on his forehead and made him drink water whenever he surfaced enough to swallow, which wasn't often. He murmured things that made no sense. He called out once for someone named Robert, his voice rough and desperate, and Louisa caught his hand instinctively and held it until he quieted. She told herself it was simply the practical thing to do. She did not sleep that first night. She sat in the ladder-back chair beside the cot and listened to his breathing, watching for the change that would mean the fever was breaking or the change that would mean it wasn't, and she let herself consider, just briefly, how strange it was that she had come to New Mexico territory at all. Thomas had wanted it. He had talked about the territory the way some men talked about heaven, with an absolute confidence that it held everything a person could want, that the land was fertile and the sky was wide, and the future was there for the taking if you were willing to work hard enough. Louisa had believed him, partly because she loved him, and partly because Missouri held nothing for her that couldn't be left behind. They had arrived in the spring of 1876 with 2 horses, a mule, a wagon full of supplies, and the kind of optimism that the territory had a way of testing. Thomas had been a good man and not a bad farmer, but the territory had tested him hard. The summer of 1876 was dry. The summer of 1877 was drier. He had been pushing too hard, working too many hours, and the horse that threw him was one he'd been too tired to handle properly. She had blamed herself for that for a long time, and then she had stopped, because blame was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had kept the farm. 32 acres of rough land with a creek that ran dependably, and a house Thomas had built solid if not elegant. And she had kept it because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to be, and because, in some complicated way she didn't fully understand, she felt that leaving would be a kind of second death for him. Around 3 in the morning, the stranger's fever broke. She knew it by the change in his breathing, which deepened and steadied, and by the way the rigid tension left his face, his features going slack and peaceful. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and felt the heat retreating, replaced by a normal, healthy warmth, and she sat back in her chair and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 16 hours. She fell asleep in the chair and woke to full daylight and the sound of a voice she had never heard before, low and slightly rough with sleep, saying, "Where in the world am I?" She straightened in her chair and found him looking at her. His eyes were brown, darker than the usual shade, and they were sharp and clear despite everything. He was looking at her with an expression of complete bewilderment that she found, unexpectedly, rather endearing. "You are in my back room," she said, "on my cot, in my house." He absorbed this. "How did I get here?" "I dragged you." He looked at her carefully. "You dragged me? From the creek?" "You were face down in 4 inches of water with a wound in your side that had gone bad and a fever that very nearly killed you." She stood and stretched her back, which protested loudly. "You are welcome, by the way." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I beg your pardon, thank you. I mean that sincerely." He tried to sit up and immediately abandoned the effort, pressing his eyes closed against whatever pain the movement produced. "Don't," she said. "You are not sitting up today." "I have to." "You will lie still," she said, in the tone she used for the mule, which was not an unkind tone, but was a tone that communicated clearly that discussion was not on the table. "You have lost a significant amount of blood and you had a fever that broke only a few hours ago. If you sit up today, I will not be responsible for the consequences." He lay back. After a moment he said, "My name is Clement Winslow." "Louisa Grady," she said. "This is my farm." "Good farm," he said. He hadn't seen it, but she supposed he meant something by it regardless. "What happened to you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Ran into trouble on the trail south of Silo Flats. There are men working that stretch of road who consider it their personal toll collection business. I didn't have what they considered appropriate payment." He paused. "I'd been riding a few days before that and I wasn't in the best condition to argue the point. I got away, but not cleanly." "Outlaws," she said, "of the opportunistic variety. The territory has plenty." She knew that was true. The Lincoln County War had only settled down in the past few months, and the violence it had stirred up had scattered hard men across the landscape like seeds. "Were you heading somewhere in particular?" "Silo Flats," he said. "I have a letter of introduction to a man named Horace Ketterly who runs the hardware concern there. I'm a carpenter by trade. He had work he needed done." A carpenter. She looked at him with slightly different attention. A carpenter in the territory could make a very decent living because good construction was desperately wanted. Thomas had been able to build a sound structure, but lacked the skill for anything more than the purely functional. The house reflected this. "Well," she said, "you will not be doing any carpentry work for some time." "No," he agreed. He looked at the ceiling. "I am sorry to be a burden to you." "You're not a burden yet," she said. "Ask me again in a week." That time she was certain she saw the beginning of a smile before he closed his eyes, and she told herself the small warmth she felt at the sight of it was nothing more than the natural relief of a person whose patient had not died. She told herself that for several days running. Clement Winslow was a better patient than she had expected, which was to say he was not an ideal patient, but he was not a terrible one either. He fought the enforced rest with a persistent low-level resistance, like a river working against a dam, always finding small ways to assert that he was capable of more than she was allowing. On the second day he insisted on sitting up. On the third day he moved to the chair by the window. On the fourth day she came in from the morning milking to find him standing in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with the careful stillness of a man who has recently discovered that standing costs something. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I was going to put a kettle on," he said. "It seemed like the least I could do." She set down the milk pail. He did look considerably better than he had 3 days ago. The color returned to his face and his eyes alert and present. Still, she could see by the tightness around his mouth that standing was not as easy as he was making it look. "Sit down at the table," she said. "I will put the kettle on. You can pour it when it's ready if that will satisfy your need to contribute." He sat down at the table. He looked around her kitchen with the open, unguarded attention of a man who was comfortable in silence and didn't feel the need to fill it with unnecessary words. She had noticed this about him already, that he could sit quietly without it feeling like absence. Thomas had been that way too, and she had valued it in Thomas, and she told herself firmly that finding the same quality in Clement Winslow did not signify anything beyond simple recognition of a trait she happened to appreciate. "You built this kitchen yourself?" he asked, after the kettle was on and she was slicing bread at the counter. "My husband built the house," she said. "I've made some modifications since." "Your husband?" He said it without the probing quality some people used, just acknowledging what she had said. "He died 14 months ago," she said. She found she could say it now without the breathless quality it had carried for the first year. "Thrown from a horse." "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you. You've been running this place alone since then." "There's a man in Silo Flats who comes out sometimes to help with the heavy work, Jessup Crane, older fellow who used to work cattle. He was a friend of Thomas's, but yes, largely alone." Clement was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the wall above the window, and she could see him noticing things, the way a craftsman looked at a structure and saw not just the surface but the bones beneath it. "That beam above the window is beginning to separate from the header," he said. "Not urgent, but it'll let in water when the rains come hard." She looked. She had noticed the gap appearing but hadn't known what to call it or how seriously to take it. "Is that difficult to fix?" "Not for someone who knows what they're doing. Hours' work may be less." He paused. "I could do it. "When I'm recovered." "You're here until you're recovered regardless," she said. "What you do with that time is somewhat up to you, within reason." She poured the tea when the water boiled and set a cup in front of him and one at her own place and sat down across the table. And they drank in a comfortable quiet that felt, she thought, surprisingly natural for two people who had known each other less than a week. Over the following days, as his strength returned in measured increments, they fell into a loose rhythm. She did the heavier work of the farm, the milking, the feeding, the endless weeding of the kitchen garden, the repair work that never stopped needing doing. He did what he could from a sitting or standing position close to the house, useful things that required more skill than strength, mending harness leather with neat, precise stitches, sharpening the tools she'd let grow dull, fixing the latch on the chicken coop that had been giving her trouble since February. He was good with his hands in the way that spoke of genuine competence rather than practiced performance, doing each task cleanly and without waste motion, and she found herself watching him sometimes from a distance and feeling a complicated mixture of gratitude and something more uncomfortable that she was not yet ready to name. He talked to her in the evenings, when the work was done and the light was going and they sat on the front step, or at the kitchen table, because she had no parlor worthy of the name. He told her about where he came from, a small town in Tennessee that he'd left at 19 because the work there had dried up after the war had taken so much and changed everything that remained. He'd spent nearly a decade drifting west, learning his trade from a succession of older craftsmen who had taken him on for various projects: a church in Kansas, a courthouse in Colorado, a series of houses in Arizona. He'd been heading toward New Mexico territory for 2 years, drawn by the same rumors of building opportunity that had drawn other craftsmen, and Silo Flats had a reputation for steady growth. "You've been moving your whole adult life," Louisa said one evening. "I have," he said. He was looking out at the scrubland where the sunset was turning everything the color of old brass. "I've thought about stopping. I just never had a particular reason to stop in one place over another." "What does a place need to have," she asked, "to be worth stopping for?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm not entirely sure," he said. "I'm beginning to think it's less about the place itself." She looked at him. He was looking at the sunset, and his profile against the light had a clean, straightforward quality that she found she thought about more often than was strictly sensible. She looked away before he turned. "You should write to Horace Ketterly," she said. "Tell him you were delayed but that you're coming. You don't want to lose that letter of introduction." "I already did," he said. "I borrowed paper and your ink 4 days ago. I hope you don't mind. Jessup Crane was kind enough to take it to town when he came by." She had forgotten that Jessup had come by 2 days ago. She had introduced Clement without thinking much about what Jessup would make of it, and Jessup, who was a tactful man, had made nothing of it out loud, though she'd seen the particular way he'd looked between the two of them as he left. "Good thinking," she said. "Ketterly wrote back already. Jessup brought it yesterday." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded letter. "He says the work can wait until I'm fit. He's a decent man by the sound of it." She was glad to hear that. She had been quietly worried that he was losing something by staying here, that her good fortune in having him around was coming at a cost to his prospects. "How long before you're fit?" "Another week for the heavy work, perhaps. The wound is healing cleanly, thanks to you." He paused. "You cleaned it properly with carbolic." "Most people don't know to do that." "I've had to be my own doctor out here," she said. "You learn or you suffer the consequences." "That's true of most things in the territory," he said. They were quiet for a while. The last light was fading and the first stars were appearing, and somewhere in the scrubland a coyote was carrying on its nightly conversation with the dark. It was the kind of evening that felt complete in itself, like a room that has exactly the right amount of furniture, nothing missing and nothing in excess, and Louisa sat in the middle of it and felt something she hadn't felt in over a year, which was that the present moment was sufficient. That being exactly where she was, doing exactly nothing, was not a failure or a waste, but simply enough. She didn't examine the feeling too carefully. She had learned not to do that with things that might be fragile. The day he fixed the beam above the kitchen window was the 12th day after she had found him in the creek. He had declared himself recovered, not fully, he admitted, but sufficiently for light work, and she had watched him stand on her kitchen table with a level and a handful of shims and his carpenter's eye and do a thing that had required exactly the skill and care he'd said it would, and she had felt a warmth in her chest that was embarrassingly distinct from mere gratitude. "That will hold?" she asked. "That will hold for 20 years, he said. He stepped down from the table and looked at the beam from below with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done a job correctly. "Thank you," she said. "What do I owe you?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Louisa, you saved my life. I found you in my creek and brought you inside," she said. "It was the obvious thing to do." "It wasn't the obvious thing to do, and you know it," he said. "Most people alone out here with no help and no obligation would have gone for the doctor and come back to find either a recovered man or a dead one. You sat up all night with me." She was quiet. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I owe you more than I can reasonably repay." "I'm not asking you to repay anything," she said, and she meant it, and the fact that she meant it so completely seemed to land somewhere in his chest by the way he looked at her. "All the same," he said, "I'd like to help. Before I go to Silo Flats, there are things around this place that need doing, and I'm good for the work now." She looked at him and then looked out the window at the yard and the outbuildings and the garden and all 32 acres of the farm that she maintained by herself and said, "I won't say no to that." "Good," he said. "Then let's make a list." The list was long, and they worked through it over the following 10 days with a cooperative efficiency that sometimes felt to Louisa like they had been doing this together for years. He replaced 2 fence rails that were rotted through on the south pasture side. He reseated the door of the barn that had been dragging on the ground since the summer before. He repaired the chicken coop roof that had developed a worrying sag. He looked at the house with a craftsman's eye and found 3 places where weatherproofing was needed and dealt with each of them systematically. She worked alongside him when she could, handing him things, holding boards while he nailed them, and they talked while they worked, the easy ongoing conversation of people who have found that their minds are comfortable in each other's company. He told her about the work he had done in other places. She told him about the farm, about her plans to expand the kitchen garden, and eventually run a small dairy operation if she could get a second cow. He listened to her plans with genuine attention and added practical thoughts. What kind of foundation a proper dairy outbuilding would need, how to arrange it to take advantage of the prevailing breeze and keep it cool. She caught herself storing these conversations up, turning them over afterward, replaying particular things he had said and the way he had said them, the particular quality of his attention when she was speaking, as though what she had to say was genuinely interesting to him. One afternoon, working side by side in the kitchen garden pulling weeds while he rested his side, which still ached when he worked too hard, Louisa said, without particularly planning to, "Do you like it here?" He looked up from the row of beans he was clearing. He didn't ask her to clarify what she meant by here, which she thought was telling. "Yes," he said simply. She looked back at the beans. "Do you?" he asked. "I do," she said. "I didn't always. There were several months after Thomas died when I genuinely couldn't tell whether I loved this land or hated it. It felt like it had taken him from me." She paused. "But it's still here and I'm still here, and I think that's something. The land doesn't take sides, it just is." "That's honestly said," he told her. "I'm generally honest," she said. "It saves time." "It does," he agreed. He was looking at her with that steady attention again, and she felt the weight of it like warmth from a fire, substantial and real. "Clement," she said. "Yes. I want to say something directly, and I want you to take it the way it's meant, which is simply as a statement of fact." He set down the clump of weeds he was holding. "All right." She kept her eyes on the bean plants. You are the first person I have felt genuinely comfortable with since Thomas died. I don't know what to do with that, and I'm not going to do anything with it immediately, but I wanted to say it because I think honesty is better than pretending." She could hear him breathing. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "I am glad you said that," he said, "because I've been trying to find a way to say something similar for about a week, and I hadn't managed it yet." She looked up at him then. He was watching her with an expression that was open and warm and careful all at once, and she thought that Thomas had looked at her that way sometimes in the early days, and she thought that this was not the same as that, because nothing was ever exactly repeated, but it was real in the same way that had been real, which was entirely. "We should finish the weeding," she said. "We should," he agreed. They went back to the weeding. But something had settled between them, the way silt settles in still water and clarifies it, and Louisa felt that settled clarity as she worked and thought it was one of the better feelings she had experienced in some time. That evening he asked if he could take the wagon to Silo Flats the following morning to meet with Horace Ketterly. She said of course. She had been expecting it and she was prepared for it, which is to say she had told herself to be practical and sensible and not attach more weight to it than it warranted. He left early and came back in the late afternoon, and she didn't examine too carefully how different the day felt without him in it, like a room where a window had been closed. He came back with supplies from the general store that she hadn't asked for, flour and salt, and a small paper twist of hard candy that he set on the kitchen table without comment, and a report that Horace Ketterly was a reasonable man who had a commission for a complete fit-out of a new building going up on the main street of Silo Flats, which would take 6 weeks of steady work. 6 weeks, she said. Based there during the week, he said. He was looking at her carefully. "I would want to come back on weekends if that's acceptable to you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Clement Winslow," she said, "you don't need my permission to travel freely." "I know that," he said. "I'm asking if you would want me to come back." She was quiet for a moment in the way that was not reluctance but was simply taking the question seriously. "Yes," she said, "I would want that." He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and it changed his face considerably, opened it up and warmed it, and Louisa thought that she had not seen him smile quite like that before and that she would like to see it again. "Then I'll be back Saturday evening," he said. He was. He came back every Saturday evening for the 6 weeks of the Ketterly Commission, riding the 8 miles from Silo Flats in the long summer dusk. And each time he came he brought something, sometimes practical, a length of wire for fencing, a packet of seeds she had mentioned wanting, a new pair of work gloves because he had noticed hers were wearing through, and sometimes not practical at all, a book from the small lending library that had recently established itself in the back of the dry goods store, a wildflower pressed flat between 2 pieces of paper that he said he had found growing in an unlikely spot near the road and thought she would like. She would set whatever he brought on the table and they would eat dinner together and talk for as long as the evening permitted, and then she would watch him ride back Sunday afternoon, and she would think about honesty and practicality and the strange specific gravity of a person who had appeared in her creek and stayed in her life. The 4th weekend he came back. They had their first argument. It was about the kitchen garden fence, of all things. She had been planning to replace the chicken wire on the west side with something sturdier to keep the deer out, and she had worked out a method she thought would do the job, using split rails she had ready. He looked at her plan and said, very calmly, that it would not work as well as another method he described, and she had said, equally calmly, that she had been managing this farm alone for 14 months and was perfectly capable of building a fence, and he had said he knew that and wasn't disputing it, but the other method was objectively better, and she had said that the method she had chosen would do perfectly well, and he had said, and this was where things went slightly sideways, "Louisa, you are being stubborn." The silence that followed had a particular quality. "I beg your pardon," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I said you are being stubborn. I'm not saying that as a criticism of your general character. I'm saying it about this specific fence. The split rail method will not keep deer out effectively because the gaps. I know about the gaps, she said. I had planned to backfill with hardware cloth. Yes, I understood that. But you would need twice as much hardware cloth as my method requires, and it will cost you more and take longer, and the result will be the same. She stood with her hands on her hips and looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. You could have said all of that less directly, she said. I could have, he agreed. But you told me you value honesty because it saves time. She opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at the fence post she was holding and then at him and then at the fence line in question. Show me the other method, she said. He did. It was better. She did not say that out loud, but she worked with it and she thought he knew, and at dinner that evening they were both quiet for a while and then she said, You were right about the fence. I know, he said. But for what it's worth, your method would have worked. It would have just cost more. That's a kind thing to say. It's also true, he said. You're very resourceful, Louisa. I don't say that to patronize you. I mean it as a genuine observation. She looked at him across the table. I know you do, she said. I don't think you say things you don't mean. I try not to, he said. Clement, yes. When the Ketterle Commission is done, what then? He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them cast a warm, steady light, and beyond the windows the night was very dark and very still. Ketterle mentioned there would be more work. The town is growing. A carpenter with a good reputation can have steady employment in a place like that. Is that what you want? She asked. Steady employment. He looked at her in that direct, careful way he had. Steady employment in the proximity of something that matters to me, yes, that's what I want. She felt the words settle somewhere under her ribs, warm and real. She was 32 acres of rough land and 1 mule and some chickens and a creek and a kitchen garden, and a house with a beam that now held properly, and she was apparently something that mattered to a carpenter from Tennessee who had arrived face down in her creek and chosen, in the slow, considered way of someone making a genuine decision, to stay in her vicinity. Well, she said, I'm not going anywhere. No, he said. I didn't think you were. The 5th weekend he came back on a Saturday afternoon instead of the evening because rain had stopped the outdoor work in Silo Flats and there was nothing to do but travel. He arrived wet and somewhat cold, and she put on the kettle and he stood in her kitchen warming his hands at the stove, and she stood beside him and they were very close together, and the kettle began to boil and neither of them moved to take it off. Louisa, he said. Yes, she said. I would very much like to. Yes, she said. He turned to look at her. I hadn't finished. I know, she said. Yes, anyway. He kissed her then, gently and with great care, in the way of a man who has thought about doing something for a long time and wants to do it properly. She kissed him back in the way of a woman who has been honest with herself long enough to stop being surprised by what she wanted. The kettle went on boiling. The rain came down steadily outside and the kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something baking that she had put in the oven that morning. When they separated, she reached past him and moved the kettle from the heat. The tea will be too strong, she said, and her voice was not quite steady. I don't mind strong tea, he said. She poured it anyway. They sat at the table and drank strong tea, and outside the rain came down harder and they talked. Not about the kiss specifically, but about things in general. About what Silo Flats was becoming, and what the territory was becoming, and what a person could reasonably hope for from a life spent in a place like this. And the conversation wove back and forth between the practical and the personal, the way all the best conversations did. That evening he said, I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to take the time you need to answer it. She set down her cup. All right. When the Ketterle Commission is finished, I'd like to have a serious conversation about what comes next. For both of us, together. He paused. I'm not suggesting anything hasty. I know you've been through a great deal, and I know that trust is something that's earned over time and not declared. But I want you to know that my intentions toward you are entirely serious. I'm not here for the summer and the good company. I'm here because I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because the last 6 weeks have been the happiest of my adult life, and because I would very much like to find out what the rest of it looks like with you in it." Louisa sat very still. "That is the most words I've heard you say at one time," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "I practiced it slightly." "I could tell," she said. She looked at him. "I feel the same. You should know that. I'm not a person who plays games with that kind of thing." "I know you're not," he said. "It's one of the things I love about you." The word love sat in the air between them with a quiet solidity, not alarming, not precarious, but there and solid and apparently meaning to stay. "Clement," she said, "let's have that conversation when the commission is finished. But not because I need more time to decide. I've decided. I just think it should be had properly." "Agreed," he said. The sixth and final weekend of the Ketterle Commission, Clement came back on Sunday morning instead of Saturday, because there had been a problem with the finish work on the building that needed his attention. He arrived looking slightly tired and entirely satisfied, the way a craftsman looks when something has been done exactly right and he knows it, and he ate the breakfast she had kept warm for him, and told her the building was the best work he'd done in years, which he said not with boasting but with the simple, honest pleasure of a craftsman. "Ketterle shook my hand for a solid 10 seconds, he said. The man was genuinely pleased. "It sounds like it was worth doing properly," she said. "It was." He set down his fork. "And now it's done." "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked at her. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay on the table between them, and Louisa thought that this kitchen, which Thomas had built and she had lived in and worked in for 3 years, felt different now in a way that she did not want to lose. "I spoke with Ketterle about the future work," Clement said. "There's a commission for a schoolhouse that the town is trying to organize, and 2 or 3 private houses being planned. He'd like to contract me on a regular basis, per project." He paused. "That would allow me to work from a base rather than a traveling position." "A base," she said. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "of asking Horace Ketterle if he knew of any land available in the area, near to Silo Flats, near to, say, an existing farm on a creek." She looked at him steadily. "There's no land available adjacent to this property," she said. "I looked into it last winter." He nodded slowly. "I see. However," she said, "there is a property that shares this property that has never been used to its full capacity on account of being run alone, which is a somewhat different situation than acquiring adjacent land." He was very still. "Louisa, I am suggesting," she said, with great precision and absolutely straight posture, "that rather than looking for separate land, you might consider a different kind of arrangement, a more permanent one, if that is consistent with the serious conversation you wanted to have." He pushed back his chair and came around the table, and she stood, and he put his hands on either side of her face with great care and looked at her for a long moment in the morning light. "Louisa Grady," he said, "would you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I would." He kissed her and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like the first kiss in the rain, which had been tentative and careful and exploratory. This was certain. This was a beginning. The preacher in Silo Flats was a man named Reverend Aldous Birch, who had come to the territory from Ohio 10 years ago, and had conducted a great many frontier weddings, and had developed a practical, warm efficiency about the business that Louisa appreciated. She did not want a great event. She wanted a real one. They married on a Thursday morning in early August of 1878, 3 months almost to the day from when she had found Clement in the creek. She wore the blue dress she had made the previous spring for no reason in particular, as if some part of her had been expecting an occasion. Jessup Crane stood beside Clement and wept unashamedly throughout the ceremony, which Clement bore with composure and Louisa found deeply touching. The hardware merchant Horace Ketterle attended because Clement had thought to invite him, and because it turned out that Ketterle was the kind of man who genuinely cared about the welfare of the people he worked with, a fact that said well of both of them. Reverend Birch spoke the old words in the morning light, and Louisa and Clement spoke their vows with the quiet intensity of people who had each survived enough to know what the words meant. Clement's hand around hers was warm and steady. His eyes did not leave her face. When Reverend Birch said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Jessup Crane blew his nose loudly into a large handkerchief, and Horace Ketterly cleared his throat in a meaningful way, and Clement smiled at Louisa with his whole face, and she thought that she was not the same person she had been on the morning she had gone to check the irrigation channel with a spade and a cup of coffee, and a heart that had grown accustomed to its own particular loneliness. They rode home in the afternoon, the two of them together in the wagon, the mule plodding its reliable course through the scrubland with the comfortable indifference of a mule, the land around them wide and bright and smelling of sage and recent rain. The territory stretched out in every direction, immense and indifferent and beautiful, the way it always was, and Louisa sat beside Clement with her shoulder against his arm, and thought about the land not as something that had taken from her, but simply as something that was, permanent and present, and full of the kind of possibility that only became visible when you stopped expecting it to look a particular way. They ate a late dinner that she had partly prepared the day before and partly assembled fresh when they got home, and they talked, as they always talked, the easy-ranging conversation of two people who found each other genuinely interesting, and the evening light came in golden through the windows and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke, and whatever she had stewed, and it was very good. What they had between them in those first weeks of being married was something Louisa found difficult to describe to herself, partly because she had only the one comparison, her years with Thomas, and the comparison kept refusing to work properly. This was not better than that had been, because it was not the same thing, and placing them on the same scale felt wrong in both directions. Thomas had been her first love, the one that had shaped her understanding of herself, and she had loved him fully and lost him, and carried that loss in a way that would never entirely disappear. What she had with Clement was something that grew in the space that loss had made. It was different because she was different, older and more deliberately herself, less inclined to bend her own shape to accommodate someone else's expectations, and Clement did not ask her to. He seemed remarkably to want exactly the person she actually was, angles and stubbornness and competence and all. He began in those first weeks building her a porch. He mentioned it first on a Sunday evening in mid-August, coming inside from a long look at the front of the house with his professional eye. "The south wall is sound," he said. "I could put a porch on the front with maybe 3 weeks of after-hours work. Nothing complicated. A good overhang and a proper railing. Somewhere to sit out in the evenings." She looked at him. "We don't have the lumber for that. I've been setting aside some from the Ketterly work," he said. "Off-cuts that would otherwise go to waste. Ketterly knows and doesn't mind. He'd rather they go to use than to burning. It's not enough for everything, but I can buy the rest and the hardware, and with what Ketterly's paying me it's manageable." She thought about a porch. She had thought about it before, actually, on evenings when she sat on the front step because there was nowhere better to sit and watch the sunset over the scrubland. A porch with a railing and a chair, maybe 2 chairs, with a roof of some kind overhead. It had seemed like a luxury she couldn't justify, a beautification rather than a necessity. "You want to build me a porch," she said. "I want to build us a porch," he said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. He started it the following weekend and worked on it in the evenings and on weekends through August, and she would sometimes come out and watch him work and occasionally hand him things. And she found watching him work one of the more satisfying things she could do with her time, not because she was idle, but because there was something in the clarity and precision of his competence that she found genuinely beautiful. The way a thing done exactly right is always beautiful. The porch came together in the way his work always came together, steadily and without drama, and to a standard somewhat higher than the functional minimum. He cut the posts square and true and set them in good footings. He laid the decking with careful attention to drainage and expansion. He built the railing at exactly the right height, substantial and elegant, and not a thing he had just thrown together. He finished it on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of September, with the summer still holding its warmth and the light taking on the first soft amber tones of early autumn. He called her outside, and she stood at the edge of the yard and looked at what he had made. It ran the full width of the front of the house, roofed and railed, with 2 good chairs he had brought from Silo Flats and a small table between them, and it was exactly what she had imagined on those evenings on the front step, and also better, because she had imagined it alone, and here it was built for both of them by someone who had looked at the house and thought about what it needed. "Well," he said. "It's perfect," she said. "It's good work," he said, with his characteristic honesty about his own craft. She laughed. "It's better than good work, Clement." "It's solid work done with good material," he said, but he was smiling, and she could see that her appreciation meant something to him, that it was not nothing to him that she was pleased. She walked up onto it and stood at the railing and looked out at the yard and the garden and the scrubland beyond, and the view from up here was fractionally different than the view from the ground, raised slightly, given a frame by the roof and the posts, and she thought that was a good way to describe what Clement Winslow had done in her life in general. He had not changed the view. He had given it a frame. He came and stood beside her, and they looked out at the territory together. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for fishing me out of your creek," he said. She laughed again, and the sound of it carried out over the scrubland and disappeared into the wide afternoon sky, and she felt in that moment the particular richness of a happiness that has come through something, that has been earned rather than simply arrived at, and she thought that this was what the territory had been all along, not a destination but a process, not a place that gave you things but a place that showed you what you were made of and occasionally, if you were very fortunate, brought you the people you needed. That autumn they worked the farm together with the particular efficiency of 2 capable people who respected each other's competence and communicated plainly, and the work went better than it had in years. Clement's carpentry reputation spread through the surrounding territory with the speed that reputation always traveled in small frontier communities, which was very fast, and he had more commissions than he could reasonably fill, from Silo Flats and the ranch operations to the south, and the small settlement of Perdition Creek to the east. He turned down the commissions that would have taken him more than a day's ride from home, which she knew and acknowledged and didn't want him to do on her account, and when she said so, he said he wasn't doing it on her account but on his own, because he was done with traveling and the farm needed another pair of hands, and he was happy here, and that was enough reason for any man to stay in one place. Jessup Crane came by in October with his mule and his weathered good humor, and spent 2 days helping them harvest the hay, and told Clement he was the best thing that had happened to Louisa Grady since running water, which made Clement laugh and made Louisa pretend to be exasperated while being privately, completely in agreement. October brought the news from Silo Flats that one of the outlaws who worked the South Road, the same men who had wounded Clement back in the spring, had been brought to justice by the territorial marshal and was facing a judge in Santa Fe. Clement heard about it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who does not need revenge but doesn't mind justice, and they talked about it that evening on the porch with cups of coffee and the night air coming in cool from the mountains. "Does it settle something for you?" she asked. "Somewhat," he said. "Not the wound so much as." He paused. "There are men out here who prey on other people because the law hasn't caught up with the space yet. That's something I have thoughts about." She knew what he meant. The territory was still working out what it was going to be, still in the rough middle period between the lawlessness of the early years and the settled order that was coming slowly from the east. She had thoughts about it too, about what it meant to be a woman alone in that period, dependent entirely on her own capability and judgment and luck, without the legal protections that existed in theory but were applied inconsistently in practice. The injustice of that was something she had thought about on many nights, the way the territory was full of women in her position, widowed or alone, running farms and small businesses, holding communities together and existing in a legal and social framework that treated them as secondary. "It'll get better," he said, slowly. "It will," she said. "Things do tend to get better slowly. It just requires someone to insist on it." She looked at him. You are a person who insists on things being right. I noticed that early. What did I do that gave you that impression early? He asked. The fence, she said. He laughed. I just said a better method was available. You said it honestly when it would have been easier not to, she said. That's insisting on things being right. He thought about this. I suppose it is. They sat with that for a moment, and the night around them was enormous and quiet, and the stars over New Mexico were the most stars Louisa had ever seen anywhere, thick and particular and permanent seeming. I'm going to have a baby, she said. The words came out quietly and without announcement, the way the most important things sometimes did, and for a moment the night absorbed them. Then Clement turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and deeply moved. Louisa, he said. Sometime in spring, she said, if my reckoning is right. He set down his coffee cup and took her hand in both of his and held it, not saying anything for a moment, and she could feel his hands warm and steady around hers, and she looked at his face in the starlight and thought that this was what all of it had been leading to, not because she needed a child or a husband to make her life complete, but because completion was not the right word for it anyway. A life was not a sentence to be completed. It was a thing that kept going, kept being made, kept surprising you if you let it. Are you happy? He said. Immeasurably, she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it in a gesture of such sincere and uncomplicated tenderness that she felt it all the way through her. And she thought that she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. The porch he had built, the coffee going cold on the table, the territory spread out before them under all those stars. Winter came in and laid itself over the land in the gradual way of New Mexico winters. Not the brutal cold of the northern territories, but a steady chill that settled into the bones of the house and required the fire kept going through the nights. Clement worked through the winter on indoor commissions, furniture for the Ketterly household, a complete set of cabinetry for a new house being built for the territory judge who had decided that Silo Flats was where he wanted to settle. The work was fine work, and he did it with care, setting up a corner of the barn as a workshop, and the smell of fresh wood shavings drifted through the property in a way that Louisa came to associate entirely with the feeling of things being right. She felt well through the winter, better than she had expected, sturdy and energetic, and full of the particular purposeful calm of a body that knows what it is doing. She expanded the kitchen garden plan, working through seed catalogs over winter evenings, ordering varieties that would stretch the growing season, planning the placement of everything with the same methodical attention she brought to all her practical work. Clement watched her work through these plans with clear appreciation and occasionally added structural notes in the margins of her planning papers, where to build a cold frame, what kind of windbreak would help the exposed east side. In February, she wrote to her sister Eleanor, who still lived in Missouri and with whom she had maintained a somewhat irregular correspondence, and told her about Clement and the marriage and the baby coming. And Eleanor's reply, when it arrived in early March, was warm and practical and full of questions. And Louisa read it twice and thought about Missouri and thought about the territory, and thought that the territory was entirely where she wanted to be. She also wrote to Clement's sister in Tennessee, whose name was Margaret and whom Clement spoke of with the particular affection of a brother, who has been estranged from a sibling by distance rather than choice. Clement didn't know she was writing until the letter was sent, and when she told him, he looked at her with an expression that combined surprise and gratitude and something else she thought might be the particular emotion of a person who has been looked after in a way they hadn't known to ask for. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to. She's your family. You should be in contact." He was quiet for a moment. "She'll want to know about you," he said. "She'll find out about me," Louisa said. "I wrote her a thorough letter," he laughed. "I imagine you did." Margaret wrote back within 3 weeks, a long, warm letter addressed to both of them, full of questions about the territory and observations about Clement that were both affectionate and accurate in a way that suggested she knew her brother very well despite the distance. And at the end, she said she would very much like to come visit if the territory was receiving visitors and they could stand the company. They wrote back immediately saying they absolutely could. Spring arrived in March with the particular force of a thing that has been held back long enough, the land going green almost overnight, the creek running fast and clear with snowmelt from the mountains, the kitchen garden exploding out of the earth in the way it always did when it finally got the warmth it had been waiting for. Louisa worked in the garden every morning, moving slower than she had in the winter, but no less purposefully, feeling the earth warming under her hands and thinking about continuity, about things that came back each year and things that were new. The baby was born on the 15th of April, 1879, on a clear Tuesday morning that started cold and went warm, and the whole business was managed with the help of the midwife from Seelow Flats, a formidable woman named Mrs. Holcomb, who had delivered more babies in the territory than she could accurately count and approached the work with a calm efficiency that Louisa found immensely reassuring. Clement was not in the room, which was the custom, but she could hear him in the kitchen, and she could tell by the particular quality of the silence out there that he was not doing anything, just waiting, which for a man of his temperament and disposition was a kind of heroism in itself. The baby was a boy, strong and loud, and equipped from the first moment with an emphatic opinion about his own circumstances. Mrs. Holcomb wrapped him and handed him to Louisa and said, "Healthy as anything," in the tone of a woman delivering a verdict that pleased her, and Louisa held him and felt the world rearrange itself around this new fact in the way it only does when something entirely unprecedented has happened. Clement came in when Mrs. Holcomb called him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Louisa with the baby, and his face did the thing it had done on the porch in October, that open, unguarded quality. "Come and meet your son," Louisa said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms and watched him hold the baby with the same careful precision he brought to all things that mattered, his large craftsman's hands impossibly gentle, his face doing something she did not have words for. "Hello," he said to the baby in a quiet voice. The baby regarded him with the unfocused intensity of the newborn and then made a sound. "He has opinions," Louisa said. "He does," Clement said. "Good." He looked up at her. "How are you?" "Very well," she said. "Very tired and very well." He reached over with his free hand and covered hers. "You are remarkable." "You've said that before," she said. "I intend to keep saying it," he said. They named him Thomas James Winslow. Thomas for the man who had built the house and worked the land and died too young but had brought Louisa here, and James because it was Clement's father's name and his father had been a good man and worth remembering. The farm in the summer of 1879 was a different place from the farm of the summer before. The kitchen garden was the largest it had ever been, productive and well tended. The barn had been reorganized and properly repaired, the outbuildings addressed one by one. A second cow had been acquired in the winter and was giving good milk. There were plans on paper for the dairy outbuilding that Clement intended to build before the next winter. The porch on the front of the house had become the center of their evenings, where they sat after the work was done, and Thomas James slept in his crib just inside the window, which they left open so they could hear him. Margaret arrived in July. She came on the twice-weekly stage from Santa Fe, a tall woman of 32 with Clement's dark eyes and a direct manner that immediately explained where certain of Clement's characteristics came from. She embraced her brother in the doorway of the stage depot in Seelow Flats with a fierceness that he accepted and returned, and then she turned to Louisa and looked at her with an expression of frank, warm appraisal. "You are exactly as he described," she said, which was not what Louisa had expected. "He described me to you," Louisa said. "In his letters," Margaret said, at great length. She paused. The word remarkable appeared several times. Louisa laughed. "I keep telling him to stop saying that." "Don't," Margaret said. "He means it." They drove home from Silo Flats in the wagon with Thomas James asleep in the basket wedged between the seat and the side, and Margaret looked at the territory around her with the open, interested attention of a person who has heard about a place for a long time and is finally seeing it. "It's very large," she said. "You get used to it," Louisa said. "Then you start to rely on it." "The sky especially," Margaret said. "Yes," Louisa agreed. "The sky especially." Margaret stayed for 3 weeks, and the time had the quality of ease and interest and expansion that the presence of a genuinely good person in your house produces. She was practical and helpful and had a dry humor that Louisa found enormously entertaining, and she and Clement spent hours talking on the porch in the evenings, catching up on the decade of distance, and Louisa would listen while nursing Thomas James and feel that the house had grown somewhat simply by being full of more life. Before she left, Margaret held Thomas James for a long time and looked at him with an expression that Louisa recognized. "You should come west," Louisa said. "Permanently." "I've thought about it," Margaret said. "I really have." "Think harder," Clement said. "There are people out here who would be glad of the company." Margaret looked between the two of them and then at the territory beyond the porch railing and said, "I will think very seriously about it." She did not commit to it, but there was something in the way she said it that felt like a promise of serious consideration, and that was more than nothing. After Margaret left, autumn began again, and they moved through it together as they had moved through the first autumn, productively and companionably, with the added dimension of Thomas James, who was progressing from sleeping to observing to attempting participation in all activities with increasing determination. Clement built a cradle that was a work of genuine art, solid and beautiful and jointed with the precision of the best cabinet making, and Louisa looked at it and thought that the difference between building something and building something with love was visible and real, and not easily defined but impossible to miss. The fall roundup on the neighboring ranch operations brought extra traffic past the farm, and Clement would sometimes go and help, because in the territory people helped each other with the large seasonal work, and it was reciprocal and understood, and Louisa would see him ride out in the cool morning, and know he would be back by nightfall and feel no anxiety about it, which she thought was its own kind of happiness, the security of trusting completely. In November, a letter arrived from a leaner in Missouri, saying that she was considering coming west. Her husband had died the previous year, just as Thomas had died, and she was alone with 2 children, and the Missouri farm was struggling, and the territory was being talked about everywhere as the place to go. She wrote with careful practicality, but Louisa could read the uncertainty between the lines, the fear of a leap into the unknown. She wrote back a long letter that described the territory honestly, the difficulty of it, the isolation, the work that did not stop, and also the beauty of it, the scale of the sky, the way the land had a kind of permanent grandeur that gave a person perspective on their own troubles, and the opportunity that was real if you were willing to work and willing to wait and willing to let the territory show you what it had to offer. She also said that there was a farm on a good creek with 32 acres of workable land, and 2 capable people who would be glad to help with the settling-in period, and that the territory needed more good people, and Alina had always been a good person. Alina wrote back in December saying she was coming in the spring. Clement read Alina's letter with a smile. "Your family is congregating," he said. "I have been alone here for 2 years," Louisa said. "I don't object to some congregation." "Neither do I," he said. "I like the idea of family." He paused. "In quantity." She looked at him. "There is something I've been meaning to tell you," she said. He looked at her with immediate attention, because he had learned to recognize when she was about to say something important. "Thomas James is going to have a sibling," she said, "sometime in late summer." Clement sat very still for a moment, and then he smiled, the full open smile that she had first seen when she told him she wanted him to come back on weekends, and it was still, she thought, one of the best things she had ever seen. "A full house," he said. "A very full house," she agreed. "We'll need to add a room," he said. "You can do that," she said. "I absolutely can," he said. He planned the addition through the winter evenings, making careful drawings on paper at the kitchen table while she read or sewed or watched the fire. And she would glance over at the drawings and see him working them out with the clean precision of his thought, solving each structural problem methodically. And she would feel the warmth of it, of being in the presence of someone whose mind you genuinely respected. Alina arrived in April with her 2 children, a boy of 7 named Samuel and a girl of 5 named Clara, and the territory received them in its customary fashion, which was without ceremony but with generous space. Clement had already spoken to a man he knew about the adjacent property that had come available after all, a small parcel with a sound if modest house, and Alina came with enough money from the sale of the Missouri farm to make the purchase and have reserves for a first year. Louisa went with her to see the property and stood in the empty kitchen with her sister and saw Alina's face do the thing that faces do when they recognize a place as theirs. "It needs work," Alina said. "Of course it does," Louisa said. "Everything out here does. That's not a problem if you're willing." "I'm willing," Alina said, with the particular firmness of someone who has decided. Clement and Jessup Crane and 2 men from the neighboring ranch put 3 days into Alina's property before she moved in, the most critical repairs done quickly and properly. And Alina moved in on a Thursday in May and stood on her own land with her children on either side of her and looked at the territory and seemed to expand into it the way all of them had, slowly and surely. Samuel, who was 7, immediately attached himself to Clement with the comprehensive devotion of a boy who had lost his father, and found in Clement someone who was patient and knowledgeable and willing to explain how things worked and let him help with the doing of it. Clement bore this with good grace and genuine warmth, taking the boy along when he worked on the farm, showing him how to use tools safely, answering questions that ranged from the deeply practical to the completely philosophical with equal seriousness. "You are very good with him," Louisa said one evening. "He's very easy to be good with," Clement said. "He's genuinely curious. That's a fine quality in a child." Thomas James, who was by now 13 months old and navigating the world at speed with the confident incompetence of a toddler who had recently discovered walking, made his own friendship with Clara, a quiet, serious girl who had apparently decided that Thomas James required supervision and had appointed herself to provide it, following him around the yard with a protective attention that Louisa found both funny and touching. The summer of 1880 was full. It was full in the physical sense, the farm productive and busy, the construction of the new room ongoing, Alina's property establishing itself through the growing season with hard work and good results. It was full in the human sense, the houses occupied, the meals shared regularly, the children running between the 2 properties as though the land between them was irrelevant. Jessup Crane came by often and was folded into the extended family with the naturalness that characterized all genuinely earned relationships. The second baby was born in August, another boy, larger and louder than Thomas James had been, and equipped with an even stronger initial set of opinions. They named him James Robert for the person Clement had called out for in his fever, his closest friend who had died of a fever 3 years ago in Colorado, a man he had spoken of with the understated grief of someone who has lost a person they expected to grow old alongside. Reverend Birch came out to the farm to baptize both boys together, which he seemed to find an efficient and pleasant arrangement, and the ceremony on the porch with the September light coming warm and flat across the scrubland had a quality that Louisa thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the good accumulated weight of everything that had happened. The grief and the work and the loneliness, and the morning she had gone to check the irrigation channel, and found a dying man in her creek, and made the decision that had changed everything. She looked at Clement across the small gathering on the porch, holding James Robert with the ease of a man who had gotten competent at holding babies, talking to a leaner with the relaxed naturalness of family. And he glanced up and caught her eye and smiled. And she thought that of all the things the territory had given her, which were many and not all of them easy, the best and most unlikely was a carpenter from Tennessee who had arrived in her creek in May and stayed. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the boys were asleep, they sat on the porch together in the last of the light, the chairs he had built, the floor he had laid, the roof overhead, the territory spread before them in its permanent, unconcerned grandeur. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am very happy," she said, "and that I know it while it's happening, which is the best way to be happy." He put his arm around her and she settled against his shoulder, and they watched the last color leave the sky and the first stars come up over the mountains. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." "Margaret is coming in October," he said. "She wrote last week." Sided. Louisa sat up to look at him. "She's moving here. She has a prospect," he said. "She mentioned a man in the letter, somewhat obliquely, which for Margaret means she's serious about him." He paused. "He's a school teacher. The new school in Silo Flats is looking for a teacher." Louisa looked at him for a moment and then laughed, a warm, full laugh that went out into the evening. "Your sister is coming to New Mexico territory for a school teacher." "It appears so," he said with great composure. "Good for her," Louisa said. "Good for everyone," he said. "Thomas James needs a school teacher in about 4 years. She laughed again. "That is thinking ahead." "I am a planner," he said. "You are," she agreed. She looked back at the territory. "Clement." "Yes. That morning when I found you. Yes. I had decided the day could not get any worse," she said. "I was coming to look at the irrigation channel and I was thinking about everything that needed doing, and she paused. "I was very tired, not the working kind of tired, the other kind." He was quiet, listening. "I want you to know," she said, "that finding you was not a burden. Not even in the practical sense, though it was practically significant. What I mean is that finding you was," she stopped, looking for the honest words. "It was like the creek bringing something it had been keeping somewhere upstream and deciding that this morning was the time to release it." He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "I've thought about that morning a great deal," he said. "I don't remember much of it. I remember the cold water and then nothing until your kitchen. But sometimes I think about what it means that I ended up exactly there, on your particular piece of land. I had been riding in bad shape for 2 days. I could have ended up anywhere. But you ended up here," she said. "I ended up here," he agreed. She took his hand. His hand was warm and familiar, and she knew the feel of it the way she knew the feel of the farm, through seasons and through work and through the accumulated ordinary days that made up a life. "I'm glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than I have words for, you know that." "I know that," she said. The stars were fully out now, the full glory of the territory sky, vast and particular and permanent. Thomas James made a small sound from inside the house, the particular sound of a sleeping child briefly surfacing and settling again, and James Robert was quiet in his cradle, and the farm was all around them in the dark, the garden and the barn and the chickens and the creek running somewhere in the night with its steady, reliable sound. Clement pressed his lips to her hair. She felt his warmth and the solid reality of him. A man who had walked through 10 years of moving and arrived where he needed to be by the improbable root of a bad wound and a deeper ford than he'd bargained for. And she thought that the territory was full of these stories. People who had come here seeking something and found something else. People who had lost everything and built again. People who had been alone and become not alone. The whole long, complicated human story playing itself out against this enormous landscape that did not take sides and did not judge and offered, to those who stayed with it long enough, the particular reward of knowing exactly what you were made of. She was made of stubbornness and practicality, and the willingness to drag a dying man out of a creek and sit up all night beside him, and make a decision in a kitchen on a rainy afternoon that turned out to be the most important decision of her life. He was made of skill and honesty, and the willingness to insist on things being right, and the ability to build a porch that was exactly what was needed, and not one thing less. Together they were the farm and the family and the evenings on the porch, and the two boys asleep inside, and the sister next door finding her footing in new soil, and the territory spreading out before them into a future that was genuinely open and genuinely theirs. Margaret arrived in October as promised, on a Tuesday stage, with a trunk of belongings and a quiet, self-possessed man named Henry Forsyth, who had dark hair beginning to go gray at the temples, and a schoolteacher's precise, careful way of speaking, and a look on his face when he was beside Margaret that Louisa recognized and thought well of. Silo Flats held a small, welcome gathering for the new schoolteacher, because a town getting its first proper school was an event of real civic significance, and Clement and Louisa attended and introduced Margaret to everyone worth knowing and watched Henry Forsyth prove himself a man of genuine intelligence and warmth, not the remote bookish figure people sometimes expected a schoolteacher to be, but a person who was interested in the people around him and said what he thought and listened when others spoke. Margaret pulled Louisa aside at the gathering and said, "You and Clement look extremely happy." "We are extremely happy," Louisa said. "Good," Margaret said. "He needed that. He needed someone who would be honest with him and strong enough to take his honesty back." "We are well matched in that way," Louisa agreed. "How is Thomas James?" Margaret asked. She had a particular affection for her nephew that had been evident from the first visit. "He is attempting to build things," Louisa said. "He picks up pieces of wood and puts them next to each other and looks at Clement expectantly." Margaret smiled. "Of course he does." "James Robert mostly shouts," Louisa said. "He is very clear about his preferences. He takes after his mother in that regard," Margaret said. Louisa laughed. "Clement says the same thing." "Clement is perceptive," Margaret said, and there was a warmth in it that was entirely sisterly. Henry and Margaret were married the following spring, by Reverend Birch in the same small church, and the celebration after was held at the farm, on the porch and in the yard, with Jessup Crane attending and weeping again, and showing no signs of finding this embarrassing, and the children running in all directions and the territory showing off one of its better spring afternoons, clear and warm with a breeze from the south that smelled of sage and something green and far away. Clement gave a toast. He was not a man who spoke at length in public, but what he said when he did speak was always worth saying. He stood on the porch steps with a glass in his hand, and said that the territory had a way of bringing people to exactly where they needed to be, whether they knew they needed to be there or not, and that he had personal experience of this, having arrived in his present location through a process he would not recommend but could not regret, and that he was glad Margaret had found the courage to make the journey and glad that Henry Forsyth had been here waiting for it and glad for all of them. Every person on this piece of land and beside it, because a life was only as good as the people you shared it with, and they were all, beyond any reasonable expectation, very lucky people. Louisa listened to him and thought that the man who had lain in her creek in May of 1878 with a bad wound and a failing pulse had turned out to be, beneath all the practical competence and the honest direct manner and the carpenter's precise hands, a man who thought about life with real depth and felt things with real completeness, and expressed those feelings simply and without performance, and that this was, of all his qualities, the one she had come to love most entirely. She stood with James Robert on her hip, Thomas James leaning against her leg, watching Clement speak, and feeling the sun on her face and the weight of the baby and the solid familiar presence of the farm all around her. And she thought about the morning she had found him, and she thought about the evening she had sat up through his fever, and she thought about the first kiss in the rain, and the proposal in the kitchen, and the wedding at which Jessup had wept, and the first porch evening when she had told him about the baby, and the night they had watched the stars with Thomas James asleep inside. And all of it was hers, and all of it was real, and all of it had come from a woman going out to check an irrigation channel with a spade and a cup of coffee, and finding something she had not been looking for. The territory was not kind. She had never pretended it was kind. It was demanding and unsparing, and it took from people as readily as it gave. It had taken Thomas. It had tried to take Clement. It had tested her in ways she had not asked to be tested and shown her things about herself she had not always been glad to know. But it had also given her this: the farm and the creek and the work she was good at, and the neighbors who were family and the sister next door and the boys who would grow up knowing what things were made of because their father would show them, and above all Clement himself, standing on the porch steps in the spring light, making a toast to luck and presence, and the improbable rightness of being exactly where you were supposed to be. She thought that was a fair exchange. She thought she would take the territory on whatever terms it offered, because this was her life and it was a very good one, and she had earned every moment of it and intended to go on earning it, alongside the man she loved, on the land they had made together, for as long as the territory saw fit to have them. James Robert made a sound of emphasis. "I agree," she told him. Clement caught her eye from the steps and she smiled back, and the afternoon went on around them, warm and full and entirely, mercifully, beautifully alive.